Hello and welcome to Based on Facts, where fiction and superstition meet logic and scientific facts. On WELT 95.7 FM, broadcasting from the Allen County Public Library. I am your host, Chris Rex, and this week we will be covering Easter, since that is the immediately following holiday after St. Paddy's Day, apparently. So, when we talk about Easter, we're talking about the first Sunday after the spring equinox, or the vernal equinox, in which that is the time point in where we see the hours of daylight equaling the hours of nighttime. As such, we kind of consider this as being a special holiday strictly because of the Christian religion. And so when we start digging into why that is, we see that, certain other religions prior to Christianity also celebrated the spring or vernal equinox. We see that case in the German tribes of Europe, considering their word for spring being Easter. We also see that in the Saxon culture, as far as calling their great mother goddess of spring and fertility, Eostre. So very, very similar to those previous celebrations and religions and deities related to spring and fertility in the first place. So it's not a surprise that Christianity, being kind of the new kid on the block, would opt some of these other religions into its own sort of belief system. And here in the U.S., many of our holidays are opted from Christianity to kind of give us a reason to celebrate a lot of different things. Now what's interesting is that when we start to look at some of the other religions and what they have done in the past, we've kind of seen this evolution of religion to opting things from the previous religions that have preceded them. So the new kids on the block, like Christianity, often end up seeing cases where we have opting from Sumerian culture, or opting from Egyptian culture, or opting from Greek culture. And we have those kind of melding together to form this idea that is Greek, or that is Christian religion, even though it's actually Greek religion that's opting from. So that starts to beg the question, well, where do we start drawing the line between what's actually novelly Christian in these other religions? But first, let's go ahead and talk about what sorts of things precede Easter Sunday, so to speak. And what we see is the Friday before Easter Sunday is called Good Friday. Alright, this is not to be confused with Black Friday, which is a Good Friday for deals, typically here in the U.S. being a consumer. But from going that point forward, we start to see, Good Friday was actually kind of this holiday invented to kind of celebrate the day that Jesus was killed. It's like, alright, well, I can see that. I can understand that. A day that Jesus was crucified on the cross. A day that we can start to think about the day of his resurrection, which is Easter, actually. That's interesting. We can definitely include that in the holiday repertoire of American culture. What's interesting is that when we start looking at the whole idea of Jesus and of his place in American society and in history, we start wondering, was Jesus ever a real thing? Like, do we even know if he really existed? And the answer is no, not really. Because Jesus was kind of this idea, this myth, this legend, this tale that seemed to be told in order to inspire certain feelings within the populace. So whether you be talking about King Arthur, whether you be talking about Robin Hood, those figures seem to really be designed by the populace to try to inspire people. And I don't fault anyone for that. It definitely seems that Jesus was one of these figures that was kind of mythologically inspired because of the fact that we don't see any evidence of Jesus in any other text other than the Bible. And what does that clue me into? That clues me into all of the evidence for Jesus being contained in the Bible, which is to say that the Bible was constructed strictly to fabricate this account of Jesus. Because normally when we look at history and we look at science, there are things that kind of relate between the two. There are subjects that are found in one and then kind of reflected in the other. But in this case, we don't see that. In the case of Jesus, we really only have the biblical account referring to him as Jesus Christ, as a leader of the Jewish people against the Roman governing body. And you would expect a dominant figure like that to be better represented in the history books from other people at the same time that were also documenting the phenomenon. And we just simply don't see that. So Good Friday kind of represents, this Good Friday before Easter Sunday, kind of represents a time at which Jesus was, according to the Bible, betrayed by one of his friends, Judas Iscariot, and he was actually one of the 12 apostles. And he, at some point, for some reason, decided to turn in Jesus to the Roman authorities. Unfortunately, later on, he decided to commit suicide and hang himself. We're really not going to talk about that. But the thing is that when Jesus was finally pointed out by Judas as being this guy who was claiming to be the new king of the Jews, that's when Roman authorities seized him, and he immediately went to a preliminary hearing before a Jewish court called Sanhedrin, where they were actually able to find sufficient reason for him to be tried and lead to an actual trial before a court in charge of Pontius Pilate. At that particular point, you start thinking, well, why were these Jewish authorities? I mean, if Jesus was going in there to help the Jews, if he was going in there to start reigning in leadership for the Jews and lead those guys forward to where they would be free of Roman authority, wouldn't you think other people that were Jewish would embrace his leadership and his power and his influence? Unfortunately, the answer is no. The Jewish authorities in the preliminary hearing court that he stood before were actually afraid of losing their power to this guy that just came out of nowhere and just started trying to incite this rebellion, essentially, against the Roman authority. So they felt threatened by him. So they're like, hey, we need to get rid of this guy. Period. This guy needs to go. So we need to forward him to a court where Pontius Pilate will be able to deal with him according to Roman law. And so once Jesus gets kind of forwarded on to this other trial, to a real trial, so to speak, he is found guilty of being someone who claimed to be the king of the Jews, to someone who was trying to incite or spark a rebellion amongst them, start some sort of insurrection amongst the Jews against the Roman authority at that time. And at that point, Pontius Pilate, he was actually kind of sympathetic to Jesus' situation. It's just that he was he seemed to be kind of coerced by the Jewish representing body of that preliminary hearing court to give the actual sentence of, hey, convicting this guy as being somebody who's trying to cause sedition among the Roman populace, Roman governed populace, and incite this resurrection. So he actually went ahead and convicted Jesus of being guilty on these accounts because Jesus was actually the person who was responsible for starting all this stuff in the first place. So, rightfully so, Jesus went and was crucified. According to Roman law, Had this been governed by Jewish people and ran by Jewish people, he would have been stoned. Since he was being handed down the sentence by Romans, they actually judged that he needed to be crucified, which is to say that he was stripped down to his clothes, he was whipped, he was forced to carry his crossbeam to the site where he had a large vertical wooden stake in the ground already. And then he was, at that site, he was forced to outstretch his arms onto the crossbeam that he'd been carrying this whole time. And at that point, they went ahead and bound and nailed his wrists to the crossbeam. And that's where he would get the marks of the stigmata, so to speak. And then the Roman soldiers kind of lifted that crossbeam about a distance of 10 feet or so onto that vertical stake that was already on the ground. So whether they used step ladders or some other means, I'm not sure, but they lifted that crossbeam with Jesus on it up to a distance of about 10 feet from the ground. That way he would literally be in a place where he would be suspended by his wrists. Now fortunately for Jesus, they actually went ahead and nailed his feet or his ankles and or bound his feet or ankles to the cross on the vertical stake to give him a little bit of chance of supporting his own weight so that he didn't suffer too much during that process. Now what's interesting is that generally speaking, when you're crucified in that manner, you can last for days, several days, just because of how long it can take the body to succumb to various things, such as insufficient blood flow, because you're up there on a stake, you're not really moving around it at all, basically. So you can end up with stale blood, so to speak, collecting in certain extremities, most notably the legs, as you're up there on the cross, and all your blood is basically pooling in the veins of your legs. Now what's interesting is that people don't often think about that as far as the importance of moving your muscles and not having a sedentary lifestyle here in the United States right now, because people seem to think that, veins and arteries work very, very efficiently on their own without any input from us to whether we can maintain a highly oxygenated body, a very healthy body, just based on the natural workings of our own system. And unfortunately, it's not really the case. What we do see is we see the arteries being very efficient at pumping blood to everything that needs oxygen. The issue comes when we think about what the veins have to do. Okay? And the veins, generally speaking, have to kind of rely on the skeletal muscles around those veins to kind of squeeze on those veins and kind of pump that blood back to the heart. And so if you're hanging across, just dangling around, you're going to have blood collecting in the lower parts of your body because you're not able to move those parts because they're nailed or bound to the cross otherwise. And so you're going to have blood just sitting there doing nothing. And when you have problems like that, you start seeing symptoms related to the poor oxygenation of various tissues of the body, because they're not getting the quantity of the blood that they need, they're not getting the level of oxygen of blood in the blood that they need. You're seeing a lot of problems with all those things that eventually lead up to problems with, maybe the heart itself is not getting enough oxygen. And so guess what? You die of a heart attack while up there on the cross. Or you start thinking about, if we're not having sufficient blood flow to our organs or internal organs, we can also have those organs dying off. And so we see a situation where a lot of different things happen as a result of being crucified. Whether it be failure of the circulatory system to deliver adequate oxygen to all parts of the body, or whether we start looking at the ability of the lungs to even draw in oxygen. Because if you're there hanging on a cross, it's kind of putting stress on all of your body down to your ankles or feet where you're also nailed or bound to the cross, which essentially puts pressure on your body in a way that makes it very, very difficult to inhale. And so when we're trying to think about what all goes into the process of inhaling, we are seeing this kind of mode towards needing to raise our rib muscles and kind of stretch the intercostal muscles between our ribs in order to kind of enlarge our pleural cavity within our bodies so that we can kind of create this vacuum of sorts that can bring air in via our diaphragm as well. All these processes kind of require us to be able to move the external parts of our body. And if all of the external parts of our body are kind of drawn downward, not only by gravity, but also by the fact that we're kind of nailed to the bottom of the cross, that really gets into the situation where you're like, oh my gosh, it makes it really, really hard to breathe. Just breathe for a few hours becomes very, very tedious and very, very painful because you have to move so much of your body just to undergo those actions of breathing in and out. So it's very, very interesting when you look at it from that perspective. Now, Jesus himself, even though you could technically live for a few days while being crucified on the cross, he only survived about 6 hours. Okay, which is interesting. Some people would attribute it to what you often hear associated with Jesus as far as, oh, he was stabbed in the side with a spear. So clearly he wasn't able to survive as long as people normally would, which was several days. But when you look at it, the scripture itself from the Bible states that he was only stabbed with a spear in the side to check to see if he was alive or not, after he was already determined to be dead by the Roman soldiers who came to check on him at the cross. So, when we start thinking about what it means to be crucified and what kind of pain and suffering they go through, it makes sense to us when we see certain terms in the English language that relate to a lot of pain or suffering. And that's where the word excruciating comes into play. Because the fact that excruciating is kind of referring to, oh, you're undergoing a lot of pain and suffering during this process of crucifixion, so that pain is excruciating. And that's how we relate those two terms. Now, another interesting thing is that sometimes when people are being crucified, people will go up there and break their legs. And that would just not only make the pain more excruciating, but it would also hasten their death because that would increase their blood loss, so increase their chances of going into shock. That would also put a damper on their ability to collect blood in their lower extremities, because really, I mean, if the break was external to where you would actually see the broken bone, that would actually just constantly flow blood out of the body, and so that person would basically experience a low blood pressure, and then they would die as a result of that. So one way or the other, breaking your legs would basically hamper your ability to support yourself on your legs while on the cross. In fact, in some cases, they were nice enough to provide ledges down there near the feet that could be used by the person being crucified to support the rest of their body. Not in this case so much. So luckily, Jesus actually didn't have this happen to him, so to speak. He was said to have just undergone crucifixion for 6 hours without having his legs broken, and then subsequently died after that 6-hour time period, just because he kind of gave up on life. Even though normally you would see people surviving for several days once they're crucified. Now, generally speaking, when people die on the cross, they are consumed. Their dead flesh is consumed by vultures, other scavengers coming in, whether they be dogs or some other creature in the area. They would come in and pick up the scraps. Bodies really weren't taken care of significantly at that point. They weren't necessarily buried. They weren't necessarily burned or disposed of. Basically just left up there for the animals to scavenge from. As they were kind of suffering from these capital punishments that warranted this crucifixion in the first place. Now, because Jesus was Jewish, and because he had some Jewish friends that kind of convinced the Romans otherwise, Jesus was actually buried shortly after he died. So he died around 3 p.m. People kind of rushed together to try to get him buried and placed in a tomb in time for nightfall. There was this superstition, this belief that if you didn't bury somebody by nightfall, according to the Jewish tradition, then they could be subject to a bad afterlife, so to speak. So to optimize their chances for a positive afterlife, you had to take them down off the cross and then subsequently bury them as soon as possible before sunset to optimize their chances for a positive outcome in the afterlife, so to speak. Now, once Jesus was taken down, he was basically kind of washed. His body was washed according to Jewish tradition. He was wrapped in these linens or cloths. He was also given some spices because you need to make dead bodies smell good to some extent. And then he was ahead and placed in that tomb onto a stone tablet or stone shelf of sorts. Now, this stone tomb was said to be only for him at that time. So it had a middle chamber to where it was just a bench, and then it had a further chamber which was just a shelf designed for Jesus' body. But on the outside, there was this rock that was kind of in place of the entrance to kind of safeguard it, to kind of secure it to some degree. And so we had that layer of security there as well. Additionally, what we had was this situation where some parts of the text of the Bible say that guards were placed outside of Jesus' tomb. And then we have other parts of the Bible that say, well, they were placed outside of the tomb, but somehow or another disappeared between that point and the point of Jesus' resurrection. So, on Good Friday, we had Jesus being crucified, dying on the cross, and then being moved to his tomb. Between 3 p.m., roughly, on Good Friday, whenever they're able to move him to the tomb, then we see the morning on Sunday, Easter Sunday, as being the time in which we have some interesting things happening for Easter. You know, we have the supposed resurrection of Christ happening. So that brings up a whole nother issue entirely as far as what happened between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. You know, as to whether those spices and oils that those people gave to Jesus before he went to the tomb, as to whether those had some sort of resurrecting effect. I don't know. As to whether there's any actual real relevance to this story, we're not sure of, because there are certain things that are very, very questionable when relating to the story. And so when we think about the story of Easter Sunday, we typically think of a couple of women, one or more women, coming to the tomb and being like, hey, all of a sudden the tomb is opened. We don't have to worry about rolling that rock out of the way to access the tomb. We are just given an opportunity to enter the tomb and look for Jesus' body so we can anoint it with further oils or spices or whatever. Well, certain other parts of the Bible and certain other gospel accounts state that, well, these women actually first approached the cave that was guarded by the Roman guards. At least one, sometimes two, Roman guards, and that they had to somehow pass by those guards to then open the cave and then enter the tomb. So it's interesting when you start hearing some of these different stories. You're like, well, what exactly happened at that cave or at that tomb? And that was something that I was thinking about when I was growing up and hearing these stories, because I'd hear these different accounts and I'd be like, okay, well, either two women approached the tomb and entered the tomb because it was already open, or you have a situation where women approach the tomb, then angels come down and open the tomb for them in front of them, or you have a situation where angels come down and open the tomb in front of the guards, then the guards go scattering from that point, or you have the women coming up to the tomb, the guards being there, and then all of a sudden an angel comes in and rolls the stone away from the entrance to the tomb. So you have all these different stories that are kind of contradictory in nature, describing what exactly happened at that entrance to that tomb. And so it becomes very, very difficult to determine what happened in reality, just according to this one account that we see in the Bible. Either way, generally speaking, we see these angels kind of coming down from heaven or already being there. These angels being either one or two in number. More often than not, though, they seem to be dressed in white, okay, which is typically where we consider them to be angels, because we tend to think of white as being the pure color of heaven, something that is representative of not being the general way that people will dress or look. So we consider angels to be these entities that are dressed in white, that either appear within the tomb or outside the tomb to roll the door from in the way of the tomb, or a few other instances here. So a lot of different ways that we can kind of incorporate the idea of angels into this situation. As to which one is actually the agreed upon case, I don't know. Anyway, very interesting. Once the women actually get into the tomb, whether they interact with the angels inside of the tomb or outside of the tomb, the angels seem to interact with the women and tell them that, hey, Jesus isn't here. So really nothing to be gained from looking in the tomb and not seeing him there, because he's not there. So don't even bother. But you know what? The women go in anyway, and they find a bunch of clothing or wrappings left over from the shelf that Jesus was placed on, and they're like, hey, somehow Jesus materialized elsewhere, or subsequently disappeared and reappeared in some other location. That's interesting, just from the fact that when you start thinking about it, you're like, was it possible for some of Jesus' followers to dig in the period of 36, 48 hours, whatever it was, from the time of Jesus' death to the time of his resurrection? Was it possible for some sort of force, whether it be some of the apostles that followed Jesus or whatever, was it possible for them to dig through that solid rock tomb and access Jesus' area of the tomb and then extract his body, leaving behind the wrappings? Just to kind of give people this false idea of, oh, he all of a sudden is resurrected in some other form. So it makes you think a little bit as to whether that actually happened. It also makes you think, if you hear these different stories of, well, sometimes in some of these stories the guards are still there outside the tomb. Other stories, the guards have already gone and the tomb is opened. So what happened to the guards? Did a force of Israelites or Jesus followers come into the area of the stone tomb and raid it, basically taking the guards off, killing them, hiding their bodies in the bushes, and then going into the tomb and then taking and removing Jesus' body? Did that happen? I don't know. I honestly have no idea. it's just one of those things that makes you think. You're like, well, there's some very suspicious things going on here. And the fact that we have different accounts of different areas at different times involving different people, what exactly happened at that tomb? We have no idea. Absolutely no idea. Another thing that kind of interests me is when you start thinking about some of these accounts after that whole discovery by the women that Jesus was no longer in his tomb. For the next 40 days or so, you see Jesus popping up in these various contexts. Whether he's showing up at a dinner or whether he is showing up at some other function along with his disciples and interacting with them. It's interesting to think about, well, what's the function there? Why is this impostor or this new Jesus taking part in these new events? Because he seemed to be very, very real. He seemed to sit down, have people touch him, even probe his crucifying marks, whether they be the nail marks in his wrists, or whether they be the marks around his feet, or even the spear thrust to his side. How is it that this can happen unless he legitimately raised from the dead? And then you start realizing a commonality between some of these accounts where people are like, oh, well, I didn't recognize Jesus at first. And typically when you interact with a person for a number of years or even a couple months, you learn to recognize them pretty quick. And so the fact that this new Jesus, this resurrected Jesus, was a Jesus that was not easily recognized by people, that was not easily picked up by all of his apostles, tells me that he was indeed an impostor. It was somebody who had gone into the tomb, stolen the body of Jesus, disposed of it otherwise, and then caused injuries on himself that were similar to Jesus's, just so that he can go in and impersonate Jesus to kind of further this idea that, oh, Jesus was resurrected. Because this entity that showed himself to apostles and things over the 40 days following the crucifixion, he wasn't a ghost. He was very much a real person. And he definitely cited a lot of Jesus' philosophies. It's just a question of, who was that? And why did they only hang around for about 40 days? And the excuse tends to be, oh, well, he all of a sudden, after 40 days, he decided to leave Earth in favor of going up to heaven with his Father. God, basically. Then you start thinking of it from a more realistic perspective. You're like, okay, well, if this was an impostor that was kind of taking the place of Jesus after he was killed or crucified, it would make sense that he only hung around for about 40 days because the infections and sorts relating from his injuries, from his wounds of trying to mimic the crucifixion, those would eventually take over his body and kill him after about 40 days. That seems perfectly reasonable to me. I don't see anything wrong with that scenario at all. So it's frustrating to me that you have a number of people kind of part of the Christian faith that are believing this stuff without necessarily critically thinking about any of it. Like, come on, why would you not be able to recognize Jesus? Oh, that's right, because somebody else was filling in for his place. So that makes sense. That's called an impostor. That's called a body double. We see that all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a perfectly human thing to do. So it frustrates me just seeing people take this account very, very literally without critically evaluating what the account of Jesus and his resurrection may be. So we can kind of take all this in and start backing up to realize, in the broad perspective, what is Christianity? What is it really composed of as far as its parts and its relevance to the life of a human being? And one of the things that I like to look at is whether or not Christianity is a monotheistic religion. Because sometimes you hear people talking about God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's not monotheistic. Having to pray to God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, that's not monotheistic. That's polytheistic. You know, when you start separating God as to being this fatherly figure into being this entity that is present in heaven, but really doesn't come down here on earth at all, and then you see a son who was kind of the product of God and a woman here on earth to form Jesus, which is considered the Son. And then you have the Holy Spirit, which is kind of considered this omnipresent, omniscient ghost of sorts that is present on both earth and in heaven. Where does that fit into all this? It's crazy to think about. You're sitting here thinking, well, I thought I had an idea of what all this meant, but then I'm hearing these ideas that, oh, well, who am I praying to? Am I praying to God? Or am I praying to Jesus? Or am I praying to the Holy Spirit? Or all three? I don't know. Aren't they all three supposed to be the same thing? Like, isn't Jesus also God? Isn't the Holy Spirit also God? It becomes very, very confusing when you start thinking about it. And so it's interesting to start evaluating that, because you start to notice that this has certain characteristics that are similar to other religions. Whether it be talking about the Grecian religions, in which you have Zeus as being the top dog, and then you have the lower level gods like Apollo, like Hades, for instance, who is god of the underworld, who is not unlike Satan in many respects. And so really, regardless of whether you just believe in God or God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, you see Satan as being this other god. And that if you believe in God, then you have to believe in Satan. There's almost this inherent dichotomy that you have to believe in. If you believe in that, really all you're believing in is a trimmed down version of Grecian belief, of things that the Greeks believed many thousands of years ago. And yet you're doing the same thing. The same thing. Okay? It's just instead of calling him Hades, you're calling him Satan. Instead of calling him Zeus, you're calling him God. Instead of calling him Hercules, you're calling him Jesus. And that starts to become very, very interesting when you think that, oh, well, Jesus was actually the result of an immaculate conception, aka it was a result of God essentially having sex with Mary to form Jesus. Because Joseph sure as heck did not have anything to do with that particular conception. So what does that sound like? That sounds like Zeus coming down and having sex with a mortal to form Hercules. Just same story, just separated by place and time, essentially. And so we can extend this to some of the other tales that we hear of in Christianity, as far as, oh, we have David, right? David and Goliath. You know, David took down Goliath, who was so much bigger and stronger than him, and he took him down with a slingshot. Wow, that's crazy. You don't often see that kind of phenomenon, right? But then you start to think, oh, well, before David took on Goliath, he actually took on another foe, a lion. And that was not unlike Hercules taking on the Nemean lion. So you're starting to think, well, dang, that really sounds very similar as far as some of the overall principles between these religions, between whether it be a monotheistic or polytheistic religion and another religion. you're seeing a lot of similarities. And part of the reasoning for that is that people kind of tend to opt different things from different religions to try to be, I don't know, almost cool or hip to the modern trends of the time. And that is not at all unlike Christianity. Definitely did a lot of that, just like all the other previous religions before that. Adopted a number of things from Egyptian theology and religion, as well as Grecian or pagan beliefs. So it's not surprising to us when we see Christianity taking these different things to try to make the conversion process, so to speak, the process of going up to somebody and be like, hey, Christianity is really cool. It's basically just like yours because of these reasons. So you should really just come over to Christianity. And then you'll end up having a better life because Christianity is the cool thing. It's the hip thing right now. So come over to us. We have very, very similar stuff. We also celebrate certain holidays in certain ways. We have Easter. We have Christmas. So you should come over to us. We see that method or technique being used by a lot of different religions all over the world throughout time. And so it's not a surprise to us when we start thinking about the history of Christianity and the future of Christianity. Because we're basically trying to get people under one umbrella. Okay, whether it be Islam or Christianity, it's just it just so happens that Christianity seems to be the dominating one at the moment. As such, we see a lot of resistance from other religions and other entities. Okay, so right now we're seeing a lot of resistance from the Islamic religions as far as their extremism, trying to fuel more followers by killing members of other religions. Okay, by undergoing some sort of jihad or something to take the life out of another person and make an example of the people who actually undergo with that life-taking process. And that's unfortunate. I hate seeing that. It really doesn't help anything. And I think what we're kind of trying to get at here is the notion that religion kind of is this tool that makes it easier to control or inspire people. Now, although it's great to inspire people, it's not so great to inspire people to kill other people, to vilify the rest of the human race on this planet because they believe something differently than you. Okay, and so we're trying to work towards this point where we are really realizing that religion is becoming more of a hindrance than it is a help. And we're seeing religion play a part in limiting the ability of human beings to ask questions, to instead try to work towards the goals of these religious leaders. If a pope goes up there on stage and says, hey, homosexuals are evil, they're the devil, they don't deserve to marry each other, then you're going to see a huge following along that line. Just because you need to vilify somebody. And I don't see the need for that, so to speak. The other interesting thing is that if you start looking at in the past, the role religion has played in the ability of leaders to control their armies, you see that more often than not, leaders claim some sort of divine influence or divine bloodline, and that helps them control their populace. It basically tells their populace that, hey, you know what? I'm part of the divine. I'm among them, among the gods. So you should listen to me. You should carry out my orders to the T without questioning, because I am a part of something that is far greater than you are. I don't like that. I actually have problems with that kind of thought process of treating yourself so much better than somebody else for no apparent reason other than the reason that you made up in your own mind. Okay, because I'll tell you right now, when you hear tales of Hercules, you don't often hear tales of Hercules going and taking over a city and becoming the governor just because he's Zeus's son. You see him going around and helping the world in a number of different ways, but you certainly don't see him often settling down in a place and just taking it over and being like, hey, my dad's Zeus, so you need to follow every order of mine, or else. That's just not how it works more often than not. The other interesting thing about religion is that you start thinking about what kind of effect, what kind of psychological effect that has on the populace that is listening to some sort of leader or such that claims some sort of divine influence. And you see that, oh, well, this gives me as a peasant under this rule, it gives me some sort of reason to kind of tread through my life, even though my life isn't perfect. But you know what? It gives me some sort of reason to be okay with and accept my miserable life, just because, you know what? If I do all these things for my leader, then in the end, I'm going to receive an afterlife that is glorious. I will receive some cookie at the end of the tunnel that will never stop, so to speak. And I'll be accepted into heaven and whatever else. That's frustrating to me, because that kind of de-emphasizes the life that we have here on this planet. The very, very short life that we have on this planet, whether it be 80 years or 50 years or whatever. We definitely need to focus on not only living life right now and on this planet, but also focus on the future generations that come before us and outlive us. The other thing that I've noticed about religion is that it tends to serve as some way of dividing and conquering the rest of the world. So if I say that, hey, if you don't believe in the Christian God, or gods, as it would be in the polytheistic way, if you don't believe in those, then I will come to you and I will take over every single thing that you own and destroy every bit of history that you own. Okay? Just because that's clearly the Christian way. And that's exactly what happened during the Crusades. You know, we had many hundreds and thousands of knights go all over Europe to conquer every country that was not Christian or not willing to accept Christian ways. And that was called the Crusades. And what's interesting is when we start looking at and contrasting Christianity to Islam and saying, oh, crusade is really just another word for jihad. In the fact that we see two different things being used to be a good reason to conquer the rest of the world. Whether it be a jihad or a crusade. One or the other, they're basically a way to go out and say, hey, you're not like me, so you're going to die. Unless you're willing to convert to me. And then we'll be friends. Until then, here's a sword through your chest. Boom. That's a problem I see. The other thing is that during this whole process of basically raping and pillaging the rest of the world to convert the rest of the world to your own religion, you see a lot of loss of knowledge or history or technology that could have been much further along than it currently is if we had just agreed to work together in the first place. You know, accepting that, hey, I have whiter skin, you have darker skin, let's work together. As opposed to this belief system of where, oh, I'm Christian, I believe in God, you are Muslim, you believe in Allah, that does not agree with me. So you're going to either have to die or you're going to have to kill me. That's such a frustrating thing to struggle with, because whatever technology or knowledge or history that those other peoples have, it would be great to be able to just work together and not have to kill everyone that does not agree with our particular beliefs. It's just ridiculous to me. Now, I'm not saying that religion is all evil, because religion certainly played some sort of important evolutionarily conserved purpose back in our times of evolving from the great apes. Okay, they really did. It's very interesting to look at that, because you start seeing, oh, well, great apes were starting to be able to developed some very complex brain structures. We were able to start walking upright. We underwent a lot of evolution, and that really helped us to free up our ability to think and think critically about the world around us. Okay, as to what our parts were in the world, and to how the seasons came about, what exactly governed the weather, things like that. Like all this stuff that we really didn't understand as far as how it worked, or how it operated, or how it influenced our everyday lives. And religion filled that gap, our gap of ignorance, so to speak. It was a great way of doing that, because having some sort of answer for that question helped calm our minds, help us focus on the daily needs of our lives, and help calm us, knowing that, hey, you know what, there's a sun god. And this sun god comes up every single day. This sun god comes up every single day, and it's all because of the way that he or she is operating in the global context. And it's the effects of the sun god that enables us to have productive crops every year. And so we have the influence of another god being the governor of our soil and of our crops. And then we have another god that's somehow influencing the oceans and the sea and the wind and the earth. We have all these different gods governing all these different parts of the world that we really don't understand. Because all these different parts come together somehow, and the only way for us to understand it as a primitive people is to assign gods to those parts. So, in the past, being Greeks, we've seen Apollo run his chariot across the sky every day. In the past, as Greeks, we have seen Poseidon rule over the seas and determine when the sea is going to be calm, or when the sea is going to be very rough and angry and dangerous for ships to cross. Attributing those different gods to those different things in life help comfort us, knowing that we at least know how to describe it. We at least have an idea of how to influence it. So if we want favorable seas for our sea voyage, we can do something about it. We have some sort of way to influence that particular thing by offering a sacrifice or gifts to the sea god if we were to make a voyage across the ocean. And it's that kind of thinking that was great many, many thousands of years ago for humans. The problem is that as we as humans began to answer more and more of the questions regarding the world around us, that's when we started to see much more of the influence of religion on stifling our ability to answer that question, or those questions. So the more questions we started to answer, the more we started to see religion as stifling our ability to answer those questions. So as we started to gain some sort of sense of community through religion, which is great, and that's excellent, we start seeing some sort of foundation for establishing rituals or cultural things. That's great, using religion as a backbone for that. But once we start getting to trying to establish some level of knowledge and technology, that's when religion can start coming in and saying, hey, you are asking far too much. You are starting to delve into the realm of the Creator, and you have no business going in that direction. That's a problem to me. Just seeing that people are going in here and they're saying, hey, you don't need to be asking questions about anything. You need to be listening to the word of your God or gods. You need to be looking at this book for all of your answers. Despite the fact that that book, when you really look at it, contains no answers. All it does is try to quench the questions that you're asking yourself. It really doesn't provide any real answers that you can apply to the real world. We look at the history of Christianity taking over the planet and becoming one of the dominant religions. And we see that at no point did Christianity itself really serve to improve the health and well-being of the populace, other than by unifying them under a single flag. So, aside from being a method of conquering the rest of the world, humanity never really got very far, technologically speaking, or health speaking, just because of some religion, whether it be Christianity or Islam or whatever. And so we start looking at it, we start seeing, oh yeah, that's when technology can start to come into play. The more and more people try, despite religious efforts otherwise, more and more people try, the more and more we actually know. And so then we can start entering the vaccine age or the industrial age, where lifespans end up increasing at an incredible rate. You know, going from an average age of 50 years old to 80 years old is incredible. Just phenomenal to think about that. And a lot of that's due to the advances in health, in science, when we're talking about vaccines, whether we're talking about healthy food and diet, whether we're talking about even our ability to make enough food, enough healthy foods for everyone, as far as crop developments and such. You know, it really comes together as far as thinking about how far we've come since the age of religion. Just because of how far our science and technology have come since then. Really quite phenomenal stuff. The influence of religion on our lifestyle seems to be derived from some ancient predisposition in our brains when we were evolving from great apes in the first place to think about some sort of higher power explanation for everything. So there's actually been evidence to suggest that religion is a deeply rooted part of our mentality, somewhere in our brains, that tells us, hey, we need to attribute all of our things in life to some sort of external factor that we can't explain. As such, there is the case that we see in autistic kids, to where we see a lot more atheistic people with autism than we do religious people with autism. And so that tells us, oh, there actually is a place in the brain, some sort of function of the brain that's being affected in autism to lead these kids to not conclude that there's some sort of God or higher power responsible for everything. So very, very interesting stuff. So it kind of brings us back around to Easter, why we even believe in Easter. Just in general, we have very, very little evidence for Jesus existing at all. So why do we believe that Easter is a legit thing when we start thinking about, the role of rabbits or the role of rabbits laying eggs? How does that play into the whole thing? Well, the fun thing is that, honestly, rabbits make sense because rabbits tend to mate in the spring and have a lot of babies. So it's another thing that's kind of representative of the fertility aspect of spring. Just going back to some of those earlier gods or goddesses of spring. The other thing is that when we talk about eggs and their importance, while you're undergoing Lent during the first 6 weeks before Easter, you're not allowed to partake in eggs in your diet. Just to participate in that fasting of special foods before Easter. And so we're like, okay, well, rabbits represent fertility, eggs represent what you can't have, so since you can't have them, might as well make them decorative and pretty, boil them up, and then paint maybe some flowers on them or something to represent what's actually happening in the outside environment. So, very, very interesting stuff there. Anyway, thank you for joining me today on Based on Facts as we talked about Easter. You can find every one of our episodes on Facebook and on YouTube simply by typing Based on Facts into the search bar. This is Chris Rex. Thank you again for joining us, and have a good one.